Coming up ahead in this episode of Xtalks Spotlight.
We did some research on anhedonia, which is the lack of pleasure in doing things. And that research was done in depression. And we found that patients didn't often use the word anhedonia, right? It's too big of a word, too clinical. But they use things like loss of pleasure in doing things, not interested. And so we were able to piece together this picture of what anhedonia means to patients in their real world using their own voice.
Hello, and welcome to Xtalks Spotlight, illuminating insights from subject matter experts and industry thought leaders. I'm Sonia Hunt. In this episode, we're asking the question, what if patients were the most powerful source of real-world evidence?
In today's evolving healthcare landscape, real-world evidence is no longer just about data points. It's about people. And when people feel safe, seen, and heard, they share with a level of honesty that traditional studies often miss. So what happens when you build a space where patients and caregivers are the experts? In this Xtalks Spotlight edition, I sat down with Dr. Joseph L. Smith, Senior Director of Scientific Solutions and Strategy at Inspire. Together, we spoke about the untapped potential of patient communities as dynamic sources of insight that can transform how we understand and support health journeys. We also discussed how community-driven data challenges conventional norms in research, advocacy, and care, and explored the implications for the future of evidence generation. Thank you for taking the time for this Spotlight interview, Joe.
Thanks, Vera. I'm happy to be here.
So to start us off, what do people often misunderstand about how real-world evidence is generated?
Real-world evidence is generated off of real-world data. Real-world data comes from things that happen to patients and caregivers in the normal course of care. So what I mean by that is that real-world data is things like your claims data that you're generated when you go to the doctor, the EMR that the doctor puts the notes into, and many other things like PROs, patient-reported outcomes, which are standardized forms that you can fill out to provide very standardized answers. Wearables like your Garmin's, Fitbits, Apple Watches, apps that collect your data, like we use Folia, interviews, surveys, focus groups, basically anything that happens to and with patients and their caregivers outside of clinical trials. I think another misconception is that once the data is generated, it tells you exactly why it's happening. But I think in order to really get into that why, we have to use some of these deeper methods like patient voice and going to patients and asking them why that's happening. And it fills some of the critical gaps that we're not finding, or some of the critical gaps that are occurring within the clinical trials that we're not able to answer either ethically or practically.
Now, Joe, how does community-based conversation contribute to richer, more nuanced health insights?
The anonymized communities provide a forum for individuals to contribute authentic conversations. And by that, I mean, there are conversations that people can have where they can really delve into their experiences, whether they're afraid or scared or anxious or nervous or sad about either their diagnosis or their treatment, or even sometimes the side effects from their treatment. It also provides a place for them to find connection, to meet with others that are just like them. And it also provides a spot for caregivers to do exactly the same thing. I think that the sentiment that we see there is expressed in many different ways and in different words than maybe some of us researchers or scientists or clinicians might use. For example, we did some research on anhedonia, which is the lack of pleasure in doing things. And that research was done in depression. And we found that patients didn't often use the word anhedonia, right? It's too big of a word, too clinical. But they use things like loss of pleasure in doing things, not interested, I am feeling lethargic or tired, don't enjoy things anymore. And so we were able to piece together this picture of what anhedonia means to patients in their real world using their own voice.
And can you share an example of something that patients have surfaced in a community before it was seen in clinical literature?
One example that comes to mind is that access issues around medications. As we know, GLP-1s have become exceedingly popular, but there's also a lot of challenges with getting your insurance to cover it. And within these communities, we've seen that patients have started to detail how exactly they're going about getting these medications without going through their insurance company or finding alternative services. In a second example, we found patients with COVID had identified some of the long COVID symptoms over 6 months before the formal recognition. And so we were able to use some of that to piece together what long COVID syndrome might look like. And then finally, we did some work that was sponsored by a pharmaceutical company, and whereby they were looking at their product. And we were looking at some of the adverse events that were being reported by patients within these communities months before even they were reported to the FDA. And I think all of this is really important because a lot of the publications you see are lagging by 12 to 18 months after the research is completed. So there's really a long delay between when the actual evidence is generated to the time that it's disseminated.
And what responsibilities come with collecting and using community-driven data?
So there's really a 3-pillar approach that we use. One, privacy by design. We want to look at the value exchange, so providing the value back to the patients, and then the transparency. And I'll go into each of those. So privacy by design means that we're consenting patients to allow us to use their data, whether it's the patient conversations they're having or data that we're collecting in the course of doing a study. All of this is governed by HIPAA, GDPR, and other regulations. Next, we want to make sure there's value in the exchange. In that value exchange, we want to make sure the patients are getting the value back from the information they're providing. So a lot of times what we will do in research is we'll plan to provide back an infographic that summarizes the research that we've done with their data to that particular community from which it was derived. And then third is the transparency. So having clear communication about both the data and the impact. So we want to make sure that everything we're doing is communicated back to the patients in both the upfront consenting and then later as we're using the data. So the patients are always partners of ours and not just participants.
And to wrap up, how do you see the role of patient communities evolving in shaping future healthcare and research decisions?
I think there's probably 2 ways that I see this evolving. The first is that patient communities will shift from being data sources to being more strategic, engaged advisors. And what I mean by this is that right now, we look at patient communities as being sort of a repository of patients and caregivers who want to share their experience with us. I think in the future, and is even happening now, we looked at these patients and their caregivers as actually strategic advisors. And I'll give you an example. So one example involves we're a study sponsor that wanted to get feedback on their clinical trial design and their informed consent form. And the reason for this was because they wanted to better understand how to reduce the barriers. They wanted to make sure the patients understood the protocol and the informed consent. And then they wanted to make it much easier for people to participate and see the outcomes that they were hoping to see in the research. So that was an example of patients serving as strategic advisors that is happening today. And then again, the second way is I see communities as being the precursor to registries. So these communities are formed for ostensibly for a reason like finding connection, support, education. But that doesn't mean that's all they have to be, right? They could be things, they could contribute to data through longer term engagements where we collect things like their EMRs, PROs, surveys, interviews, focus groups, etc. And we can use all of those to design a really rich, robust data set that is very targeted and specific to that condition or therapeutic area.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, for speaking with us today. We really appreciate your time and insights.
Thanks, Sarah. I was glad to be here and happy to provide my insights to you and your audience.
We look forward to learning more about Inspire's work in uncovering real-world evidence. Thank you all for joining us for this Xtalks Spotlight feature. We hope you enjoyed the discussion.